Greetings humans, Zalost here, and yeah, it's been a while. So, today I'm going to talk a little bit about something I got in the mail recently, which is going to be a lot of fun. So we're going to do this as a two-part video. So the video is actually going to be broken up into two segments. First segment, I'm going to talk about the meat of the video here. So, I clear up my workspace here. The Sega Genesis comes in two models. The Model 1, noted because it's a bit bigger than the Model 2, has the physical on-off switch, reset button, volume switch, front audio port here, has this nice dome shape to it on the front top, and of course it has two Genesis ports, and if you have an early revision like mine, it has the external kind of expansion port on the back, as well as the one on the side here, which is used for this one here being used for plugging the Sega CD. Model 2 has audio video, power, cartridge slot, Sega CD expansion slot, power button, reset button, and then two controller ports. The controller used commonly is the 3-button controller, shown here, which has A, B, C, up, down, left, right, and start. Examples of games include this one here. I left here for an example, which they usually came in these nice hard shell boxes with a manual. And, luckily enough, cartridge. So you can see the cartridge kind of went sideways in these boxes. Now, what I got today is something really special. This, something called the Mega Amp. Now, something the Model 2 suffers from that the Model 1 does not is a kind of analog noise. And that's caused by a number of things, but mostly it's caused by a deficiency in the audio card, because they're making cheaper audio cards for the Model 2 than they were for the Model 1. Now, for the Model 2, I actually have a SCART set up for it. Now, the cables are good. I made them myself, in fact, and checked everything out thoroughly. I've been looking into making one for this one as well. And I never knew it was a problem, because I've had this Model 2 since I was about 3, 4, something like that, really early on, a long time ago. It would have been about 20 years ago now. This was my first console. Now, I didn't know it was a problem. I just thought it was something that came with the console, but I learned a few years ago that no, actually, the Model 1s, especially the early ones, didn't tend to suffer from this problem, but the Model 2s did. This Mega Amp, specifically in this case, this is model version 2.0, the Mega Amp 2. This, when you set it up correctly, will actually eliminate that noise. So that's what this video is about today, is just going in to my Model 2 and opening it up and installing the Mega Amp directly to the motherboard. Now, to begin with, we need to remove these screws on the 4 spots on the outside of the Genesis case there. After removing the screws, then we go ahead and remove the shielding. We won't actually be needing the shielding after this point, because we aren't using the RF connector at all. Then finally remove the 2 screws on either side of the motherboard, remove it, and remove the shielding from the case, before finally beginning to desolder the capacitors. There are several capacitors removed. Most of them are clustered together, luckily. This motherboard happens to be revision 1.8 of the Model 2, which makes it relatively easy to actually modify. Moving further, as we continue to remove the capacitors and approaching the midway point in our mod job here, you'll notice I'm actually going through and double checking my desoldering work, as it's actually quite tricky. Now, I would actually not recommend using a desoldering iron for this because you can actually burn the traces on the motherboard when removing it, or if you do, use a high-grade professional one. Otherwise, go ahead and use the solder wick. I then removed 2 resistors. There's a good reason for this. Those 2 resistors actually are the only other spots on the board to access the direct sound output from the motherboard processor chip itself, the 6800, which then routes through which we're using to bypass the audio chip there before routing it back through to the mega amp. This is to clean up any distortion and ensure everything's working. Notice here I'm actually going in there and resoldering a couple times. It actually burned the traces, so I had to move further up the circuit board and do a direct mount to the motherboard trace instead of the spot where the resistor was. That was a minor mistake on my part. If you're careful, you hopefully won't make the same mistake. Now, to begin with, once I'd mounted the trace, I had no further issues, and it was just a simple job to mount the other wire and start getting things ready to mount the actual audio amp, which I had adjusted the wire down, burning a bit of the sheath, to actually make it short enough so I could get at it, as I'd cut it too short with the wire clippers, or nail clippers. Now here you can see I'm actually soldering wires to the board, but from here on it gets a lot easier, because all of it except for the part on the audio chip board, the mega amp, is through-hole soldering, and that's relatively simple. You just slide a wire through, solder to the board, solder to the other board, and you're good to go, and it's pretty straightforward from here. Notice again that I'm flipping the board back and forth so I can get a good look at the underside when I do the soldering, so I can make sure I get good connections there. You always want to make sure you get a nice, good amount of solder, but not too much. So you got to do it right. Luckily, through-hole soldering is relatively straightforward. Finally, after this next step, I actually went ahead and started soldering to, instead of removing the 2 traces like is listed on the website, I decided to solder directly to the voltage regulator. That voltage regulator steps it down to the correct voltage of 5 volts and then a ground. There's also an input, but you don't want to wire to that. So if you're careful and know what you're doing, it's relatively straightforward to just wire to the solder points on the opposite side of the board, fit it together, and screw it back in. Notice again I did not put the shielding back in before I screwed it back together. This is because we will not need this. Now, this first part is showing the audio before the audio mod chip was installed. Notice the noticeable buzzing sound on one channel or the other, as that is a kind of interference caused by analog noise due to the way the board is laid out with the different power connectors. This was not present on the Model 1. Notice here on the second video portion here, this is without the audio, this is with the audio mod put in. Notice the noticeable decrease in buzzing and the increase in clarity and sound. It's far better. It's separated better, it's got much more clarity to the different parts, you can definitely tell the difference, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So what are my thoughts on this? Well, I wouldn't recommend it for beginners per se, because it's still a bit tricky if you don't know how to solder in the first place, and I'm lucky I actually had a couple test boards to go ahead and see different techniques and try them out on, that I'd gotten as junk not working anyway, but I'd managed to get working in one way or another while I actually learned how to reverse engineer this. Finally, I will say that the price is worth what you pay for. It's not a requirement, but if you like old consoles and you want to get the best out of your Genesis, I'd highly recommend the Mega Amp. So, until next time, this is SpookyZalost, signing off.